There's a moment each night when the world seems to exhale. The noise subsides, the crowds disappear, and the visible order of things gives way to silence. Midnight is not simply the dividing line between yesterday and tomorrow, it is a hinge point. Scripture repeatedly treats the night watches as moments of decision, revelation, and conflict. While most people surrender this hour to fatigue or distraction, history reminds us that some of the most consequential events, both sacred and catastrophic, have unfolded in the dark. After midnight, your rational defenses are weakened. Your emotions speak louder than your reason. Your imagination becomes fertile ground, and your discernment is tested. This is why the ancients understood the night not as neutral time, but as contested space. When vigilance sleeps, influence speaks. The tragedy is not that darkness exists, but that people underestimate it. They assume nothing of consequence can happen while the world rests. Yet it is precisely when you are tired, alone, and unguarded that your deepest assumptions are rewritten. Midnight does not create weakness, it reveals it. Tonight, we are not speaking of superstition, but of patterns, observable, repeatable, and deeply human. There are 3 things you must never do after midnight, not because the clock is magical, but because you are vulnerable. Ignore this, and you will invite consequences you did not intend. Midnight is not merely a point on a clock where one day hands itself over to the next. It is a threshold, a crossing, a liminal space where conditions subtly but decisively change. Throughout history, moments of transition have always carried heightened significance. Doorways, borders, intersections, and crossroads are not powerful because of superstition, but because transitions alter posture. When you cross from light into darkness, from activity into stillness, from company into solitude, something shifts within you. Midnight marks such a transition. It is the hour when vigilance matters more than comfort, because comfort tempts you to disengage precisely when discernment is most needed. At midnight, the external structures that guide your behavior during the day are absent. Schedules dissolve, expectations fall silent, and accountability retreats. The mind, no longer constrained by routine, begins to wander. This is not inherently dangerous, but it is undeniably influential. The thoughts that surface during this hour are rarely filtered by logic or challenged by conversation. They arrive quietly, often cloaked in familiarity, and they feel convincing because resistance is low. Vigilance at this point is not about fear, it is about awareness. To be vigilant is simply to recognize that not every thought deserves permission, and not every impulse requires obedience. Fatigue plays a critical role here. When the body is tired, the will weakens. Decisions that would seem absurd at noon feel reasonable after midnight. Old memories replay with new emotional weight. Regrets gain volume. Fears feel prophetic. This is why vigilance must replace comfort. Comfort says, relax, nothing matters right now. Vigilance says, pay attention, because everything that enters now sinks deeper. Midnight thoughts have a way of bypassing surface reasoning and lodging themselves in the subconscious, where they quietly influence future choices. Consider how often major personal crises are preceded not by dramatic events, but by unguarded moments. A careless word spoken in exhaustion. A message sent when restraint was asleep. An idea entertained just long enough to take root. Midnight does not force these outcomes, it invites them by lowering resistance. The danger is not the darkness itself, but the assumption that darkness is empty. Silence does not mean absence. Stillness does not mean neutrality. In fact, the quieter the environment, the louder internal voices become. Ancient watchers understood this. They divided the night into watches because they knew attention could not be left unattended. Someone had to remain alert while others rested. In a sense, vigilance after midnight is an internal watch. It is the conscious choice to remain present with your own mind. Comfort would have you surrender awareness entirely, numbing yourself with distraction until sleep arrives. Vigilance asks you to either rest intentionally or remain alert deliberately, but never drift unconsciously. There is also the matter of timing. Midnight is when reflection turns inward. During the day, you act. At night, you interpret. You assign meaning to what has already happened. If that interpretation occurs while vigilance is absent, false conclusions feel authoritative. A single night of careless interpretation can undo weeks of disciplined thinking. This is why wisdom traditions caution against making vows, judgments, or conclusions in the night watches. The mind is powerful then, but not always accurate. Vigilance does not require attention, it requires sobriety. To be sober-minded is to recognize your condition honestly. After midnight, you are not at your strongest. Acknowledging that is not weakness, it is wisdom. The person who knows when not to trust their own thoughts is far safer than the one who assumes clarity never fluctuates. Comfort whispers that you deserve release, that you can let your guard down. Vigilance responds that rest is sacred, but surrender is selective. Midnight then becomes a test, not of morality in the dramatic sense, but of attentiveness. Will you notice what enters your mind? Will you delay conclusions until daylight? Will you protect the inner space where future decisions are formed? The threshold does not demand heroics, it demands humility. Those who respect the hour do not fear it, they simply refuse to treat it casually. Because once vigilance is abandoned, comfort does not protect you, it exposes you. What you allow into your mind after midnight matters far more than most people realize, because this is the hour when mental gates are unguarded and filters are weakened. During the day, your mind is protected by layers of activity, conversation, and conscious reasoning. You compare ideas, test them against reality, and dismiss what does not fit. After midnight, those defenses grow thin. Fatigue dulls skepticism. Silence amplifies suggestion. The mind becomes receptive, not discerning. This is why the content you consume in these hours often bypasses analysis and embeds itself directly into belief. After midnight, the brain is no longer interested in debate. It is searching for resolution. It wants closure, comfort, or stimulation, anything that alleviates the strain of wakefulness. In this state, images carry more weight than arguments, tone matters more than truth, and repetition feels like confirmation. A single sentence heard at the wrong hour can linger longer than a dozen heard in daylight. This is not mystical speculation, it is human psychology operating under exhaustion. The danger is not that the mind is open, but that it is open without protection. This is why ancient disciplines warned against certain forms of engagement in the night watches, not because knowledge is dangerous, but because context is decisive. Information consumed when you are tired does not sit on the surface of the mind, it sinks. It blends with emotion. It attaches itself to memory. What you watch, read, or listen to after midnight often becomes the raw material for your dreams, your anxieties, and your self-talk in the days that follow. You may forget the source, but you will feel the effect. There is also the illusion of privacy. After midnight, people assume no one is watching, that choices made in solitude carry less consequence. Yet the mind remembers everything it absorbs. Late-night exposure shapes inner narratives precisely because it feels unobserved. You are less guarded about what you allow in because you believe the moment is inconsequential. In truth, it is formative. Repeated exposure in these hours subtly normalizes ideas that daylight would challenge. What once felt foreign begins to feel familiar, and familiarity is the first step toward acceptance. Consider how often late-night content targets emotion rather than reason. Fear-based messages, nostalgic memories, unresolved conversations, and speculative scenarios all find fertile ground after midnight. The mind, seeking meaning in stillness, strings these inputs together into stories. Not all stories are true, yet once a story forms, it influences expectation. Expectation then shapes perception. This is how unexamined midnight inputs rewrite how you interpret the world the next day. Another danger lies in the false sense of clarity that arrives late at night. People mistake intensity for insight. An idea feels profound because the environment is quiet, not because the idea is sound. Fatigue strips away nuance, leaving stark conclusions that feel decisive. This is why people send messages they regret, make commitments they later question, and adopt beliefs that collapse under daylight scrutiny. The mind confuses emotional resonance with truth when critical faculties are offline. Guarding what enters your mind after midnight is not about avoidance of thought, it is about stewardship. You are responsible for the soil you cultivate. Seeds planted in exhaustion grow differently than those planted in clarity. Once planted, they do not ask permission to grow, they simply do. The wise understand that discipline at this hour protects freedom later. What you refuse to entertain at midnight often spares you from inner conflict at noon. The goal is not paranoia but intention. Either rest fully or remain alert deliberately. Drifting between the two invites influence without accountability. After midnight, your mind deserves protection, not indulgence. What you allow in during these hours will echo far longer than you expect, shaping attitudes, reactions, and assumptions long after the night has passed. Words spoken after midnight are not ordinary words, because speech is never neutral. Every word carries direction, intention, and alignment. During the day, words are buffered by noise, interruption, and immediate correction. Others hear you, challenge you, or redirect you. After midnight, words fall into silence. They are not diluted by response. They linger. And because silence offers no resistance, what you say often returns to you with amplified force. After midnight, speech tends to bypass the rational mind and emerge directly from emotion, memory, or impulse. Fatigue strips away restraint. The careful editor inside you is asleep, while the raw narrator is fully awake. This is why late-night words are often exaggerated, absolute, and emotionally charged. You don't say, "I'm tired." You say, "I'm done." You don't say, "This is difficult." You say, "Nothing will ever change." These are not harmless expressions. Spoken repeatedly, they begin to function as declarations rather than descriptions. There is a profound difference between processing a thought and proclaiming it. After midnight, that boundary blurs. The mind is inclined to externalize internal turbulence. Words become a way to discharge emotional weight. But once released, words take on a life of their own. They shape memory. They influence expectation. They teach the subconscious how to interpret experience. What begins as venting can quietly become belief. This is why careless speech after midnight is so costly. You are not merely expressing how you feel. You are rehearsing a narrative. The more often a narrative is spoken, the more authoritative it becomes. Over time, the mind stops questioning it. It accepts it as truth. And once accepted, it guides behavior. A person who repeatedly speaks defeat in the night will unknowingly prepare for it in the day. Another danger lies in speaking into the void. After midnight, you often speak without feedback. There is no immediate correction, no facial expression to signal excess, no interruption to break the momentum. This creates the illusion that words spoken privately carry less weight. In reality, they carry more, because the primary listener is you. You are always present when you speak. You hear your own voice more than any other. And after midnight, your internal listener is especially impressionable. This extends to written words as well. Messages sent late at night often reflect temporary states but produce permanent consequences. Tone is misread. Intention is distorted. What you meant as honesty is received as finality. What you thought was clarity becomes confusion. Many relationships fracture not because of what was said, but because of when it was said. Midnight removed context, and words without context are easily misinterpreted. There is also a spiritual dimension to speech in the still hours. Throughout history, spoken words have been understood as instruments of alignment. Speech is not just communication, it is participation. To speak is to engage, to agree, to invite. When discernment is low, agreement can be careless. Words spoken in exhaustion often align with fear rather than truth, despair rather than hope, impulse rather than wisdom. Alignment does not require intent, it requires consent. Speech is one form of consent. Silence, in contrast, is not passivity. It is restraint. Choosing not to speak after midnight is often an act of strength, not suppression. It allows emotion to pass without being immortalized in language. It preserves ambiguity where clarity has not yet arrived. Daylight has a way of refining what the night exaggerates. What feels urgent at 1 a.m. often feels unnecessary at 9 a.m. Often feels unnecessary at 9 a.m. Often feels unnecessary. Silence creates space for that correction. This does not mean words must never be spoken at night. It means they must be chosen with unusual care. If you speak, speak what you would be willing to repeat in the light. Speak what builds rather than fractures. Speak what builds rather than fractures. Speak what names reality without surrendering to it. And when in doubt, delay speech rather than rush it. Words can wait. Consequences rarely do. After midnight, the safest posture is restraint. Not because words are dangerous, but because they are powerful. And power without clarity is unpredictable. The wise do not trust every impulse to speak, especially when the mind is tired and the world is quiet. They understand that what is spoken in the dark often echoes longer than intended. After midnight, passivity becomes a silent liability. It feels harmless because it looks like rest, but there is a critical difference between intentional rest and spiritual negligence. Rest is chosen. Negligence is drift. At this hour, drifting is especially dangerous because the structures that normally guide your attention are gone. You are no longer responding to alarms, responsibilities, or external demands. What remains is whatever you default to when nothing is required of you. That default reveals far more than daytime behavior ever could. Passivity after midnight often disguises itself as neutrality. You tell yourself you are doing nothing, when in fact something is being done to you. Influence does not require your participation, it requires your inattention. When vigilance is absent, the mind absorbs without evaluation. Images, memories, fears, and suggestions wander freely across your inner landscape. You may believe you are merely lying awake, but your inner world is being quietly rearranged. Negligence at this hour is particularly costly because repair is slow. Daylight discipline cannot easily undo what nighttime negligence allows. You can be focused, productive, and intentional all day, yet a single unguarded night can introduce patterns that persist for weeks. This is not because night is stronger than day, but because the mind is more permeable. When boundaries are down, even small influences leave deep impressions. One of the most subtle dangers of passivity is that it feels justified. Fatigue whispers that you deserve disengagement. It tells you vigilance is unnecessary, that effort can wait until morning. But the question is not whether you should rest. It is how you rest. Passive rest hands control to whatever arrives. Intentional rest sets boundaries even in stillness. Negligence, on the other hand, allows exhaustion to dictate direction. Consider how often people stumble into destructive habits, not through deliberate choice, but through late-night drift. Endless scrolling, revisiting old wounds, replaying conversations, imagining worst-case scenarios, none of these are planned. They happen because nothing interrupts them. Passivity creates a vacuum, and vacuums are always filled. The mind will not remain empty. If you do not choose what occupies it, something else will. There is also the illusion that nothing significant can occur while inactive. Yet some of the most formative moments in a person's life happen while they are doing nothing. Identity is shaped in these quiet hours. Beliefs are reinforced. Assumptions are cemented. When passivity reigns, the mind defaults to familiar patterns, even if those patterns are harmful. Negligence does not create new problems. It entrenches old ones. Spiritual negligence after midnight is not about dramatic failure. It is about small surrenders. Choosing not to redirect a destructive thought. Allowing resentment to replay unchecked. Letting despair speak without challenge. These are not loud rebellions. They are quiet permissions. Over time, they accumulate. What you permit repeatedly begins to feel inevitable. And what feels inevitable eventually feels true. The remedy is not constant effort, but conscious posture. Even rest can be guarded, choosing to sleep rather than drift. Choosing to release the day rather than rehearse it. These are acts of vigilance, not strain. They acknowledge human limits without abandoning responsibility. They recognize that fatigue is real, but influence is also real. After midnight, you are not called to solve problems or make decisions. You are called to protect the ground where tomorrow's decisions will be made. Negligence at this hour hands that ground over to chance. Vigilance keeps it intact. The difference between the two is subtle, but the consequences are not. Passivity may feel harmless, but it quietly shapes direction. What you neglect in the night, you often struggle with in the day. After midnight, isolation becomes intensified. During the day, solitude is buffered by the awareness that others are nearby, that communication is easy, that help is accessible. At night, especially after midnight, isolation feels deeper, heavier, and more absolute. This is not merely emotional, it is contextual. The world appears asleep, unreachable, and distant. In this environment, isolation becomes a crossroads. It can turn into sacred communion or dangerous vulnerability depending entirely on how it is approached. Isolation after midnight magnifies whatever you carry into it. If you enter with gratitude, reflection deepens. If you enter with unresolved pain, that pain echoes. There is no distraction to dilute it. Silence does not soften emotion, it concentrates it. This is why some people experience profound clarity at night while others descend into despair. The difference is not the hour, but the posture of the heart and mind. Danger arises when isolation is mistaken for abandonment. The mind, already fatigued, begins to interpret silence as absence. No one is here slowly becomes no one cares. This progression feels logical in the moment, but it is a distortion born of context. After midnight, perception shrinks. You lose sight of the larger picture and interpret temporary silence as permanent reality. In this state, isolation becomes a breeding ground for false conclusions. Yet the same isolation can become sacred when approached intentionally. Throughout history, the quiet hours have been used for reflection, prayer, and alignment. Not because the night is holy, but because distractions are absent. When isolation is framed as opportunity rather than threat, it becomes a place of grounding rather than threat. It becomes a place of grounding rather than collapse. The difference lies in whether you engage the silence or let it interrogate you without response. Vulnerability increases after midnight because defenses are down. Emotional boundaries loosen. Memories surface without invitation. Regrets revisit without restraint. In isolation, there is no external voice to challenge these intrusions. If left unchecked, they begin to define the narrative of the night. What should have been a temporary emotional state becomes an interpreted identity. I feel alone becomes I am alone. This is the danger of unguarded isolation. Another risk is substitution. When isolation feels uncomfortable, people seek artificial connection. Late-night communication often carries an urgency that misrepresents reality. Messages sent to fill the silence often create more emptiness. Temporary relief is followed by confusion or regret. Not every connection is nourishing, especially when sought from a place of depletion. After midnight, discernment about companionship is as important as discernment about content. Sacred isolation, on the other hand, is marked by intention. It does not ask silence to entertain. It asks silence to reveal. It recognizes that being alone does not mean being disconnected. There is a difference between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is chosen, loneliness is interpreted. After midnight, that distinction must be guarded deliberately, or it will be lost. The mind in isolation after midnight often revisits unresolved questions. This can be beneficial if handled with humility, but destructive if handled with finality. Night is a poor judge. It asks questions better than it provides answers. When isolation is allowed to demand conclusions, it oversteps its role. Reflection should inform, not decide. What you ponder in isolation should be carried into the light for confirmation, not settled in the dark. To navigate isolation wisely after midnight requires reframing. You are not abandoned. You are undistracted. You are not exposed. You are quiet. When silence is treated as enemy, it attacks. When treated as space, it serves. Isolation is never neutral, but it is always malleable. The posture you adopt determines its effect. After midnight, isolation will either draw you inward toward clarity or inward toward collapse. The hour itself does not choose. You do. Those who respect this distinction learn to use solitude without being consumed by it. Those who ignore it mistake vulnerability for truth and silence for judgment. The night will always be quiet. What matters is how you listen. After midnight, thoughts arrive differently. They do not knock. They surface. In the stillness of the hour, the mind becomes a wide, unguarded field where ideas appear with unusual clarity and urgency. Many people assume that thoughts emerging in silence are wiser, deeper, or more truthful simply because they feel profound. This assumption is dangerous. Not every thought that arrives in the stillness originates from wisdom. Discernment, especially after midnight, is not optional. It is essential. Fatigue alters perception. The brain's ability to evaluate, compare, and test ideas weakens as energy drains. What remains is imagination, memory, and emotion. These are powerful faculties, but they are poor judges of truth when left unchecked. After midnight, the mind favors coherence over accuracy. It prefers a complete story, even a false one, over uncertainty. This is why speculative thoughts feel so convincing at night. They resolve tension quickly, even if they distort reality. Many midnight thoughts masquerade as insight. They feel sudden, elegant, and undeniable. Yet clarity of feeling is not the same as clarity of thought. The quiet environment amplifies internal signals, making them seem authoritative. A fear sounds like a warning. A desire sounds like a direction. A suspicion sounds like certainty. Without discernment, these impressions are granted credibility they have not earned. Another danger is the recycling of old material. After midnight, the mind often revisits unresolved experiences. Past conversations replay with revised dialogue. Old wounds present themselves as current threats. Regrets dress themselves as revelations. Because the environment is quiet, these recycled thoughts feel fresh even though they are not new. Discernment requires recognizing familiarity. If a thought has appeared many times before without leading to resolution, it is unlikely to become wise simply because it appears again at night. There's also the temptation to assign meaning prematurely. The mind seeks significance in patterns, especially when tired. Coincidences feel intentional. Emotional spikes feel prophetic. After midnight, the line between intuition and assumption blurs. Discernment does not dismiss intuition, but it delays agreement. It asks for confirmation, context, and consistency. Midnight is an excellent time to observe thoughts, but a poor time to enshrine them. Another subtle threat is self-accusation. In the still hours, the inner critic gains volume. Without external interruption, it speaks in uninterrupted monologue. It reviews failures, magnifies flaws, and predicts outcomes with grim confidence. These thoughts feel personal because they use your own voice, yet familiarity does not equal truth. Discernment recognizes tone as well as content. Wisdom convicts with clarity. Accusation overwhelms with weight. The former invites growth. The latter paralyzes. Discernment after midnight often means choosing not to engage. Not every thought requires response. Some need to pass without commentary. The mistake many make is assuming that attention is harmless. Attention strengthens whatever it touches. The more you analyze a distorted thought at night, the more entrenched it becomes. Discernment sometimes looks like postponement. This can wait until morning, is not avoidance, it is wisdom. There is value in nighttime reflection, but only when paired with humility. Humility acknowledges the limits of current perception. It resists the urge to finalize conclusions in exhaustion. It allows questions to remain open. Discernment protects humility by preventing premature certainty. After midnight, certainty is seductive because it offers relief. Discernment resists relief that comes at the cost of accuracy. The wise treat midnight thoughts as data, not directives. They observe without obeying. They note without affirming. They record without ratifying. This posture preserves insight without surrendering judgment. Daylight can then evaluate what night revealed. What survives the light is worth keeping. What dissolves was never true to begin with. After midnight, the danger is not thinking, it is trusting every thought equally. Discernment separates signal from noise. It recognizes that stillness amplifies everything, not just wisdom. Those who practice discernment understand that the mind is creative when tired, but creativity is not the same as revelation. The night may reveal questions, but answers belong to the light. After midnight, the world removes its scaffolding. There are no crowds to mirror your behavior, no schedules to regulate your movement, no expectations pressing in from the outside. What remains is choice in its rawest form. This is why midnight is not just a time of vulnerability, but a test of intention. It exposes whether you live by design or by drift, whether your inner life is governed by purpose or surrendered to impulse when no one is watching. During the day, intention is supported by structure. You wake at certain hours, respond to demands, fulfill roles, and navigate obligations. Even undisciplined people can appear focused when systems carry them forward. After midnight, those systems vanish. The question becomes simple and uncomfortable. What directs you when nothing requires you? Impulse thrives in this vacuum. It does not need planning or justification. It only needs availability. Impulse after midnight is particularly persuasive because it promises immediate relief. Sleepiness, boredom, restlessness, and emotional residue from the day create discomfort. Impulse offers quick solutions, distraction, indulgence, emotional release without regard for consequence. It speaks in the language of urgency. Just this once, it doesn't matter. You can fix it tomorrow. Intention, by contrast, speaks quietly. It requires foresight and patience, both of which are scarce when tired. The danger is not occasional impulsive behavior, it is the formation of patterns. Repeated midnight impulses quietly shape identity. What you repeatedly choose when unobserved becomes who you are when observed. The mind learns from consistency. If impulse governs the night, it will eventually influence the day. Discipline is not built in moments of ease, but in moments when impulse has the advantage and is resisted anyway. There is also the illusion of inconsequence. After midnight, actions feel detached from outcome. The future seems distant. Tomorrow feels abstract. This temporal distortion weakens restraint. Choices are made as though they exist in isolation, when in reality they are links in a chain. Intention sees continuity. Impulse sees only the present moment. Midnight tempts you to forget that you are always becoming something, even in stillness. Intention after midnight does not mean constant productivity. It means conscious direction, choosing sleep over stimulation, choosing reflection over rumination, choosing silence over reactive communication. These choices may seem small, but they reinforce authorship over your inner life. Impulse relinquishes authorship. It allows circumstance to write the story. Intention insists on participation, even when energy is low. Another revealing aspect of midnight is privacy. When no one is watching, self-justification loses its audience. You are left with your own standards. This can be unsettling. Many people discover that their values are borrowed from external pressure rather than internal conviction. Midnight strips away performance and reveals alignment. Do your private choices match your public principles? Impulse often thrives on secrecy. Intention does not fear solitude. Living by intention requires pre-commitment. Decisions made in clarity must govern moments of fatigue. Without pre-commitment, impulse always wins. This is why habits matter. A practiced intention becomes automatic, even when strength is low. Midnight is not the time to invent discipline. It is the time discipline proves its presence. The quiet of midnight also exposes avoidance. When distractions fade, unresolved matters surface. Impulse tries to smother them. Intention allows them to exist without panic. It recognizes that not everything must be resolved immediately. Some things require rest, not reaction. Impulse confuses discomfort with emergency. Intention distinguishes between the two. Ultimately, midnight asks a single question: who is in charge when no one else is? The answer is given not in dramatic declarations, but in small, private choices. Drift is easy. Intention is quiet. But over time, the quiet choices accumulate into direction. Those who learn to govern themselves in the night discover that the day follows more easily. Midnight does not create character. It reveals it. And what it reveals is shaped by whether you live by impulse or by intention.